Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Richmond, EWA Public Editor. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this EWA webinar on what educators and families are saying about remote learning. Before we begin, let me just go over a couple of quick pieces of housekeeping. If you have a question for one of our speakers, you can type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And please ask your question at any time during today's webinar. We'll get to them at the Q&A session at the end. As soon as the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and it helps us improve. Now on to the main event. There are plenty of anecdotes on this nation's massive pandemic-driven experiment with remote learning. But what is the reality? What do we know about district spending, staff morale, and student engagement during the COVID-19 crisis? What do families say are their top concerns about their children's educations, both in the present moment and in terms of their long-term goals? And how is the pandemic reshaping how teachers communicate with students and families? Today's guests are going to help us answer those questions and also give education reporters a blueprint for using new national survey data as a launching point for covering these crucial issues in their own schools and school districts. Today, we are joined first by Bib Hubbard. She is president and co-founder of Learning Heroes, a national nonprofit organization focused on helping parents get access to the information and resources they need to support their children's academic progress and growth. They partner with other organizations who share similar goals, including the National PTA and Common Sense Media, among others. We're also joined today, I'm pleased to say, by Holly Kurtz. She directs the Education Week Research Center, which produces standalone studies as well as analysis for Education Week, and also those special reports that we all rely on for data, such as quality counts. She began at Education Week in 2014 after earning her doctorate from the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education and completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Colorado's Denver School of Public Affairs. She was an education reporter and covered other beats for about 11 years before that. We're very glad to have both of you with us. Bib, I'd like to start with you and ask you to share some background and information about some new research and survey that's come out of Learning Heroes. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emily, and pleased to be here with all of you today. Thank you for giving us some time. I'm going to try and move really quickly because I have way too many slides in 10 minutes, so apologies, and we can go back and ask questions later. But for those of you who are not familiar with Learning Heroes, just a quick little bit of information. I founded Learning Heroes about 5 years ago to inform and equip parents so that they could be their child's best education advocate. And we focus on giving parents a complete and accurate picture of how their children are both developing and achieving. We help parents understand what are the expectations their children need for learning. And then we also connect parents to the actions that they can take to best support their children. And we do all of this through research. So as we're here today, this is our 5th annual survey, but we've done several other national surveys focusing on low-income parents and parents of color. And we create content based on the research. The data really informs everything that we do. And as Emily mentioned, we are lucky enough to partner with some incredible organizations you can see here. And they take our content and distribute, disseminate, and communicate with parents. And so last year we reached 23 million parents. So that's just a little bit of background about us. But as we think about the research and why we're here today, excited to share what we've learned coming out of the field. So in terms of what our questions were for Parents 2020, we really wanted to understand how has this remote learning experience changed parents' perception about their children's achievement, if at all? What keeps parents up at night? What worries them? What are the interactions that parents and children are having with teachers and schools? And importantly, how will this change parents' behaviors as we look to the fall? And so initially we came out with some of these, kind of big insights, eager to hear from you about what your perceptions are and key takeaways. But some of the major ones are, parents are activated. We're really encouraged to see that despite the challenges, they're deeply engaged with their children's learning right now, and they are going to show up differently next year. Parents continue to deserve an accurate picture, yet we still see a massive disconnect. We see 92% of parents, and this is regardless of race, income, education level, believe that their child's at or above grade level in both reading and math. And all of you are very familiar with the national data, the state data. 37% according to NAEP are proficient or above. And the good news is, though, this is an opportunity to redefine the relationships in schools, between schools and families. And so as we look to the fall, we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but we're really encouraged by what we're hearing from parents. So let's see if I can get this moving. There we go. So our methodology, really quickly, this is probably one of the largest polls that you'll see, at least to date. We surveyed more than 3,600 parents and guardians across the country. It's a nationally representative survey, but we also importantly wanted to oversample with certain types of parents so that we could get a complete picture. We know that everybody is not experiencing this COVID moment in the same way. So we oversampled, as we traditionally do with African American parents, Latino parents, but we also looked at parents whose children are in transition grades. So 5th grade going into 6th, 8th into 9th, 11th into 12th. And then we also looked at the COVID hotspots. So California, New York, Washington. As you can see here, we fielded it in between April 14th and May 6th, so it's pretty fresh data. We offered this survey, as we do in everything, in English and Spanish. And then a note about what you're going to see on these slides. If you see blue, it means it's statistically higher. If it's red, it means it's statistically lower. And then we also have added in some data from our 2019 survey. So you might see a green arrow up or a red arrow down. That means there's a statistically significant difference between 2019 and 2020 data. So let's dive in. So parents, they're rising to the challenge. They are feeling a whole range of emotions. When we asked, what does it feel like to be a parent today? The dominant feeling is anxiety and worry. That's sort of the one that comes forward when we ask a separate question, like what's the most dominant feeling? But you can see that that's, that sort of fits in with hopeful, grateful, and optimistic, which me as a parent, I was, initially surprised, but then I thought about it and I'm like, nope, that makes total sense and is pretty inspiring to hear. And then when we ask parents, what keeps them up at night, what are their major worries, not too surprisingly, missing those important social interactions with friends and school rises to the very top. Someone obviously getting sick in your family is a distinct worry. But number 3 and 4 is making sure your child stays on track for the next grade, and that concern that these school closures will negatively impact your child's education. Rounding out by too much screen time, even more so than food or financial security. So that was of great interest to us, that education really is rising to the top in terms of concerns and worries for parents right now. And even in these uncertain times, also quite inspiring, parents' aspirations are even higher for their children. You can see that the importance of going to college has increased, their perception about their children's ability to be successful in college has increased. And you can see for African Americans and Hispanics, those numbers are even larger. So with that context and parents really digging in, they do now have a deeper appreciation for teachers. I think that's been pretty widely reported. We absolutely saw that in our data as well. 95% say that they've heard from their child's teacher in some way, yet only 33% say they have regular access to their child's teacher. And what's important about that is when we've surveyed teachers in the past, the number one way teachers say that a parent can know how their child is achieving is ongoing communications with teachers. So for us, this is sort of the beginning of a story that you'll see emerging around parents' desire to be in communication with their teachers. And again, you've heard, I think this has been reported too, they feel more connected to their day-to-day learning with their children. But interestingly and importantly, they want to know what material their child is missing at the end of the year, and what is the plan? How are schools going to make up that material? 70% agree that they really want to know more about that. Yet, despite all of this engagement, and I sort of led with this in the insights, we were very surprised actually to see that we still have this very huge number of parents who believe their child's at or above grade level. But then when you start to peel the onion, 83% of parents say that their children are getting, B's or above. So if and most parents, as we know from our previous research, are basing that perception on their children's grades. So it isn't too surprising that they're still carrying that perception with them a month or so in. And interestingly, we asked if parents thought that their children would need additional academic support to catch up next year because of the situation, and only 36% said that they would agree. And as we started to think about that, part of it, I think, is this inflated view, but also part of it is because I think all kids are sort of experiencing this at the same time, and so all kids are going to need some form of catch-up. So my child might not need additional catch-up because we're sort of all in this moment together. So just an important context as we dive into what the day-to-day looks like for parents right now. 90% of parents are using school-supplied resources and materials for instruction at home. Only about 23%, not even a quarter, are using resources from outside their school. You can see it's higher among those families without a reliable internet access, 41%, elementary school parents working out, that should be outside from home, and households that have their own technology and resources, as opposed to the school supported ones. Yet, despite the 90% of parents who are relying on those school-supplied resources, less than half are saying that they received these key resources. We gave parents 13 items, different kinds of resources that we believe are important for student instruction at home. And I was shocked to see how few resources are making it into homes right now. So clear expectations for daily, weekly schoolwork is only 39%. 61% are not getting access to that. That's so critical to know how your child is achieving. So again, not too surprised that parents have this inflated view if they actually don't know what the clear expectations are for their kids. And then you can see even fewer parents receive those personalized one-to-one kinds of supports. And you see this as a theme emerge. Parents are hungry for those resources that meet their children where they are and are really highly personalized. So this graph is a little complicated, but basically we took the 13 items, and of the parents who received these items, those blue charts, the blue bars, we asked how helpful are the resources you've received. And you can see the ones that have the yellow boxes around them are the ones that are the most helpful to those parents who've received them. And there is that theme. They're very personal. So personal technology issued by the school, only 30% received it. Personal guidance for how best to support your child, one-to-one tutoring, remote learning, a hotline where you can call and ask a personal question, mental health support services for your child. So you'll see a theme emerge here. And similarly, in terms of how parents are communicating ongoing with parents, schools and teachers are communicating with parents, mostly it's through email. And while that is helpful, parents would finding the text messages and phone calls the most helpful. Again, back to that personal theme. If you can actually talk to that teacher about what's happening with your child, you can text. It's not just a robo email that's sort of coming to all the parents. So interesting and important to note what parents find the most helpful. And as we think about how children are spending their day. So parents say 56% of their child's day involves a screen. So that sort of maps back to that worry that they're spending kind of too much time on screens. And 46%, I was sort of surprised by this, almost half of their day is spent doing some sort of online schooling. And then specifically, that translates into about 4.2 hours on average for children, how they're spending their time during the day. Yet, we still see almost a quarter, 22% of parents who say their children are spending less than 1 hour per weekday on schoolwork. And those parents are higher among those who don't have reliable internet access, are missing a device or access to the internet at all, and a parent working outside of the home. So that's important to note that parents are experiencing this very differently, especially the quarter percent, 22% here. And then we asked parents, how much time are you spending on your child's remote schooling? And quite a bit, I would say. So 2.5 hours per day, they're dedicating to their children's remote schooling. And not too surprisingly, it's higher among elementary school parents who are, kind of have to be in a little bit of a more of a hands-on mode. And what does that mean as we look forward? So we asked a few questions about, what parents, what they would favor or oppose in terms of different kinds of options for making up some of this lost time. So making academic summer school courses available so students can catch up. There's a lot of favorability there. Starting the school year early, a little bit less favorability, a little bit more opposition. Most opposition falls in extending next year into next summer. And interestingly, about 45%, almost half of parents said that if it were safe to send their children back to summer school for this academic catch-up, that they would be very or extremely likely to do so. 55% of African American parents said they would be very or extremely likely to do so, and 58% of Latino families said they would be very or extremely likely to do so. So there is an appetite, if it's safe, to send children back to summer school for that academic catch-up time. And this is sort of the money slide and where I'll end. And I was so encouraged and excited to see this chart. So we asked parents, what will you do differently next year? What is likely to happen for you? And you can see here, getting a better understanding of what my child is expected to learn in his or her new grade level. So getting a better understanding, finding more time to talk to my children about their everyday assignments, better understanding of where my child is academically, talking to that teacher, developing a stronger relationship. And you can see with African American and Latino families in particular, those numbers are even more, even higher. So really excited to see that parents, their expectations are going to increase next year. They're going to take on this sort of more active role, I believe, in helping support their children's learning at home. And as these COVID closures may continue to happen, we're hoping that districts will take this data to heart and make sure that as they're redesigning their school environments, that parents are right in the middle of that, so that they can play the role at home that they aspire to play, and that they say they're going to do. So with that, I'm going to hit pause and turn it back to Emily, if I can figure out how to get out of here.
Well done, Viv. Thank you very much.
Sorry,
We're now going to turn it over to Holly Kurtz, and she's going to share some findings from some recent surveys done by Education Week's Research Center, looking at a lot of these similar issues, but different perspectives, different voices, and I think a really interesting complement to what they've just shared. So Holly, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and Ben, thank you. It's interesting to hear the parent perspective after surveying educators. Just going to really briefly give you a little bit of information on who we are at the Education Week Research Center, nonprofit founded in the 90s. We are the independent research arm of Editorial Projects in Education, which you probably know is the publisher of Education Week. We do data journalism and surveys for our journalists. We do the analysis behind quality counts, and we also do a lot of external research for external partners, including EWA. We have done research for them. Let me tell you now about what you're here to learn about, which is the coronavirus surveys. Back in early March 10th or 11th, we decided to send out what we thought would be one survey about how the coronavirus was impacting schools. At that point in time, I think over 80% of district and school leaders told us that none of their schools were closed and they were not even considering closing any. That changed, of course, the next time we did the survey. We weren't even sure if they would respond to the survey during this very, difficult and fraught time, and we were shocked when we received a response of over 1,000 people in just 24 hours. And that made us, think that we should keep on doing this, that there was a lot of interest from educators in sharing what they were doing and also learning more about what their peers were doing. So we are now up to our 6th survey, which is in the field right now as we speak. And You can see most of our surveys attracted about 1,000 people. We had one that attracted in early April that attracted 1,700. For the most part, we have surveyed teachers and district leaders. This upcoming survey, though, will include teachers, principals, and district leaders. This was probably one of our findings that generated the most interest and controversy. We asked teachers simply, how many hours a day do you spend working right now? And then we asked them how many hours a day they spent working prior to the coronavirus. They told us that they are spending about, on average, 2 hours less per day working. We then also asked them how many hours a day students were spending learning, and that also declined. So what explains this? What explains, the teachers we heard from, tended to say, well, I'm working a lot more. But when we started looking at the data, it made sense that they might be working a little bit less, because there are a lot of things in their life, professional lives, that teachers cannot do or do to such a great extent right now. So for instance, we found out that as over time, less than 40% of teachers say they have daily or more contact, so daily or multiple times per day contact with most of their students. So obviously a lot of teachers' time is, when schools are open, is spent having contact with students, and when that's not as feasible, then there is less, there is less, opportunity for them to engage in that activity. We also found that a lot of students are basically sort of, the way we ask the question is, what percentage of your students are essentially truant during coronavirus closures? So missing in action, not locking in, not making contact with you, et cetera. We found on average it was 21%. That does vary somewhat by grade level, but it's 19% at the elementary level, which is way higher than we asked them last time what percent they would have said were essentially truant before schools closed. And by far, every grade level, et cetera, people were saying it's 3%, 2%, 4%. So this is a lot different. We also saw some pretty big differences by district poverty rate, and this is a theme that we've been seeing throughout our data. So we're seeing that in the lowest poverty districts, teachers are reporting 11% truancy rate as compared to 28% in these highest, and 29% in these much higher poverty school districts. So one thing that I think would be a really interesting story to pursue would be to really closely explore how teachers are spending their day, what they're actually doing, and how students are spending their day, what they're actually doing. Because again, we see this people spending much less time, both teachers, according to teachers, that students and teachers are spending much less time. So for instance, if teachers say that students went from having 6 to 3 hours of learning time per day, what are students doing with that time? What are teachers doing with their time in your local area? Not only is learning time different in length, but it looks different. So people are doing different things with that time. I don't have the statistic on the chart, but one thing, for instance, that teachers are doing a lot less of is testing and test prep. And that's especially true in the high poverty districts that spend a lot of time, that were, quite honestly, probably more likely to be spending more time on that than before. However, they are not necessarily, since they have test prep out of the way, they're not necessarily using their time to present new standards aligned material. So this would be sort of new core content. We have only 31% of teachers, in fact, saying that now that schools are closed, they're spending more time on presenting new standards aligned material. Instead, most of them say they are spending more time on review. And not surprisingly, most of them are spending a lot more time troubleshooting problems with technology. So that would be something else to explore. Looking at, in your district, we had some, I read through a lot of open-ended responses to our last survey where we actually had some people in tech support for districts saying this has been so stressful, I can't keep up with the requests. So that would be something else to look into, is what's going on with the tech support and technology troubleshooting in your district. When we picture teachers teaching during this time period, so often we picture them, having a live Zoom meeting class with their students. At least back when we last asked this question on March 25th, this was not actually the predominant approach. The predominant approach was collecting and returning work online. You see down there in the red is 21%. That's a percentage of teachers who say that students are interacting with each other and with them, the teacher, during live classes that they teach at specific times. So we asked that question again in a similar question again, or actually this question again on a survey that's in the field now. And I think the percentage of people doing this sort of live interactive instruction is probably going to go up, because this was, again, in late March when districts had not quite, gotten themselves organized to provide remote learning. But still, it's important to realize that instruction does not necessarily mean, basically taking the class and transporting it to the student's home and offering this interactive experience like you would have in the classroom. So all these changes have been difficult for people. Here what I'm showing on this graph is the percentage of teachers, students, administrators, and hourly employees whose morale is lower than prior to the closures. And the people who are answering this question are teachers and administrators. So teachers are answering this question about students, and consistently and increasingly, teachers are telling us that student morale is lower than it was prior than it was before the closures. Same for teachers. Teachers are telling us that, teachers and administrators alike are telling us that teacher morale is lower than it was prior to the closures. So, that's something that I would really look into with teachers. We have a question on our survey that's in the field right now that asks what principals are doing to try to improve teacher morale. That's something you might want to look into in your own district. How are teachers coping with this, and what are districts doing to deal with this sort of difficult and in some ways demoralizing aspects of the closures? So the homework gap, which is the gap between access to the technology you need to do homework for higher and lower income students, this is very real. One thing that we found, I'm not showing it in this particular chart, is prior to the coronavirus closures in February, we asked teachers what percentage said their schools had at least one device for every student, and that actually has not changed. It's about the same now as it was prior to the closures. And as you can see, now as then, there is a great disparity between students in higher and lower poverty districts, and also students at different grade levels. So, for instance, we see to the left, we see a chart that shows the percentage of students who have access to one-to-one. I think the most dramatic one is probably if you look at the high school level. So, in the lowest poverty districts, 96% of teachers say they have one-to-one at their schools, one device for every student. In the highest poverty districts, only 45% say that their high schools have at least one device per student. So this homework gap is kind of being compounded by the grade level gap, where elementary schools didn't have as many devices to start with, and then this is combined with the gap of basically higher poverty districts are being less likely to provide a device for every student. As we know from other data, low-income households are less likely to have their own devices. One thing that we also found on our most recent survey, which was 2 weeks ago, we found that a lot of students are sharing devices with parents, siblings, and other family members. So in the highest poverty districts, we have we have a much higher percentage of, we have more than half saying that more than half of teachers are saying more than half their students are sharing devices with family members. And these are the devices they're using to complete schoolwork. This is not, a device used to play a game or something. So that's another thing to take into account, when you look at these sort of technology gaps. Think about not just the poverty level, but the grade span, and also think about even if families have devices, who else is using those devices and what else are they using them for? Is mom trying to do her job from the device? Are there siblings, trying to at different grade levels and with different needs who have classes at the same time who are trying to share a device? Inequities, we hear a lot about inequities in technology, but they're not just about technology. Here are some other examples of, throughout all this data, we have found a lot of inequities when it comes to higher and lower poverty school districts. For instance, we find in general, whether it's because more students are missing in action or because of how their teachers are providing instruction because they lack access to technology, but students in higher poverty districts are they're receiving less instruction. So when we look at the percentage of teachers who interact with their students on a daily basis or more, it's about half in the low poverty districts, and it's only about a third in the high poverty districts, the highest poverty districts. We also see that teachers in these higher poverty districts are significantly less likely to say that they have the knowledge and the support they need to provide quality instruction during the coronavirus closures. So they're receiving less instruction, and their teachers are reporting receiving less support. I'm going to turn now to more of our surveys with this survey data. Where I'm just really touching the tip of the iceberg with this data. We have so much from all these surveys. We have data on a lot of different topics, but I'm going to pivot now to away a little bit from the classroom and students to look at sort of the outlook for the budget. Back in late March, we asked district leaders, if you had a crystal ball, do you think that your spending will in the next year will increase, decrease, or remain the same? Less than half back then thought it would decrease. At that right now, that's hovering more closer to 60%. Predict that spending will decrease over the next year. And the last time we also asked them, if you think it's how much do you think it will? If you think it's going to decrease, how much do you think it'll decrease by? Fairly consistently, district leaders are predicting that their spending will decrease by about 15% in the next year. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on, because districts and district leaders in responding to other questions have also told us things like we're spending more on certain things right now. For instance, technology, other curriculum for remote learning. So if spending on these sort of immediate coronavirus related needs is happening, but they expect that overall it's going to be declining in the next year, what something has to give. So what are they cutting? What are they planning to cut back on next year? We've been asking in another series of questions, are they going to have a hiring freeze, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to wrap things up by giving you a little bit of a look ahead. We asked on our survey 2 weeks ago, what are your plans for opening school again? Most common answer was we're planning for multiple scenarios depending on the advice of health officials. But we also have over a quarter of respondents saying that they had not planned for any scenarios related to opening schools during for the coming school year. So that if you are a reporter in one of those districts, you might want to sort of find out, well, why haven't you planned, or why haven't you planned? What's going on? When are you going to have a plan for what to do? We also asked district leaders 2 weeks ago what supports and services they're planning to provide. More than half say they're going to provide interventions for students who are behind academically, social and emotional learning program, and mental health services and referrals for students. In fact, teachers and district leaders are very concerned for the most part about students' mental health during this time and their ability to identify students with severe problems. Much less common, though, are things like nurses to conduct temperature or wellness checks for students and staff. So I would also sort of look into your district's plans for some of these things, like having the staff on hand to do a temperature check, that sort of thing. And with that, I'm going to let me give you a little bit of a preview for our next survey. We're going to, in our survey in the field now, we're going to be delving into summer learning plans, also more into the reopening plans. We have quite a few questions on educators' plans to stay in their jobs or return in the fall. On their perceptions on reopening and precautions. We have a question where we ask them if they or somebody who they had very frequent contact with had a condition that made them more vulnerable to coronavirus. So I'm wondering if we'll find some interesting results, being able to break that out. We also have asked teachers how old they are. So as we've heard, it appears that people who are older tend to suffer reactions that are stronger to the coronavirus. So we'll be able to look at that and see if there are differences by age in terms of teachers who plan to leave versus remain in their positions. And we should be releasing results from this current survey that's currently in the field. We should be releasing results in the next week. The next survey after that will be June 3rd and 4th. If you do have questions about the survey, or if you'd like to ask me if we have data on something that you're writing about right now, feel free to email me and reach out to me, and I'll do what I can to look through our data and see if there's anything that might be helpful to you. This is national data. We can't break it down to give you information about your district or state, but I think it helps to be able to put your local situation in context, even if you're not able to have localized data that's about your area that you cover. And with that, I'll turn things over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Holly. Just to clarify, is this nationally representative data?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So folks, if you want to go ahead and start adding your questions, I want to let you know that we've got Bib for about another 10 minutes. She was kind enough to fit this webinar into her schedule. She's got another event to get to. She's going to be dropping off at about 1:50. So we're going to start with questions for Bib. Bib, there are a lot of great story ideas in the Learning Heroes survey. I'm wondering, though, if maybe you could start out by telling us what people should not be using the data for. Are there any red flags or things you'd want to caution people about?
Yeah, I think not to sort of, overgeneralize. Every 14,000 school districts, 14,000 different experiences for parents. So it was really interesting if you look at the data where there were very consistent through lines. But I think it is important to go to, find out what your local context is. We've heard many, there's the SERPI data that shows, some districts have stopped instruction altogether. They've closed campus and they've closed school for good. So I think it's really important to take this as the broad context, but then really dig deep, into your local community about what those parents are experiencing, because I think that's your local story there. I can't hear you, Emily.
Novice error. Is there a story you would love to see reporters do or be inspired by from this data?
Yeah, I think that for us, it would be fascinating, especially if you're a local reporter, to look at this overconfidence issue. So looking at sort of what does the state NAEP data say about, and other state data say about student performance, seeing how parents' perceptions map with that. NWEA issued their sort of COVID slide research that shows that 70%, there's up to 70% learning loss. So I think sort of digging into sort of what are the local implications, and then what's the role for parents. So we know from our data, parents are motivated and activated to take different actions next year. So making that a really local story to underscore the importance for parents to have this complete and holistic picture. So as they go back to fall and students are assessed with those new diagnostics, whatever states or districts choose, there is some sort of parent opportunity to get access to that information. So I think sort of digging into this perception gap in a way that's not blame or shame for teachers or for parents, but just as an opportunity to get greater information and sort of create the tools necessary to engage those parents as we know they want to be engaged, but really make that hyper-localized. And then similarly, just asking the district and sort of to what Holly was saying, what are the plans for the district to do this academic catch-up to address learning loss. What are those plans? We know the 70% of parents who want to know what those plans are. So really pushing districts to explain to parents what that looks like and what's the role of parents in that, as these COVID closures might continue to happen and parents are going to be back in the situation.
No, Viv, it's interesting. I was wondering if the idea that parents may be overestimating their students' grade level ability and their academic knowledge, does that translate to they might underestimate how much they're going to lose or fall behind in this gap and what might be coming in the fall?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that, yes, I think that they are underestimating. And it goes back again to sort of the fact that parents don't understand the clear the expectations of what their children are supposed to be learning. So without that essential piece of information, it's kind of impossible to know what that learning loss will be like and to actually assess where they are today. One of our tools called the readiness check that we've had for 2 years now has been in super high demand by parents because they are struggling to figure out, where is my child right now? How can I assess if they are on grade level or even mastering the foundational skills they need to master? So I think finding ways to give parents the understanding of where their kids are, what Texas is doing, TEA put out that whole parent, the end of year assessment that has no stakes attached to it. I think that's pretty interesting and cool, and I'm dying to see if parents actually have their kids take the assessment so that they do get sort of a picture of how they're tracking against what they're supposed to be mastering in their grade level. So I think that they do absolutely go hand in hand, and it's an opportunity for us to get parents more information and more ways to assess where their kids are and find ways to help teachers connect with parents in an ongoing way. I mean, Holly's data just really underscores how parents and teachers are not communicating right now. It's really difficult. So, how can districts in particular help support the capacity of teachers who are struggling to figure out this technology? I think that's a really important story. Teachers are trying really hard. And parents are giving, I think, the district and teachers the benefit of the doubt now, but I don't know if that will last for the fall.
Understood. Holly, you mentioned that the data is not available with state-by-state breakdowns, but Viv, Matt Kaufman from the Solutions Journalism Network is wondering if you have state-level data.
We do. We oversampled, as I mentioned, in Washington State, New York, and California, so we are happy to pull that data out for folks if that would be helpful.
Terrific, thank you. Holly, I'm also curious, and some of our attendees are wondering if Ed Week is going to be sharing any data on how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting students broken down by racial subgroups as well as socioeconomic status.
That's a good question. We could definitely put a question on one of our future surveys that asks about racial status of the school district. Because especially since we know that certain racial groups have been hit differently than others when it comes to the coronavirus. So that would be great. But for now, we actually don't have that data.
Okay, thank you. And just a reminder, we're going to have Bib for just a few more minutes. If you have a question for Bib, you should get those in now. I do have a question for Holly. This comes from Kara Newhouse, one of our education journalists attendees. Hi, everybody. We're very glad to have you all here. Teachers reported less daily contact with students, but did you ask about anything related to the frequency of contact with parents?
Not on what the data I have now, but we do have something about that on our survey that's in the field right now.
Oh, great.
That makes sense. And Holly, I asked this question a bit, I'd like to ask it of you as well. There's a lot we can do with this Education Week data, but we always like to throw in a little caveat emptor when necessary and when appropriate. And I'm wondering, is there anything you'd like to remind people not to do with these survey results?
I wouldn't make too much of small differences from one administration to the next. In fact, many of the really large differences that we're seeing are differences that have to do with what's going on now versus what was going on in late March. And I guess I think that's the main thing.
Okay, good. I just want to remind folks that we have some terrific resources on the EWA website, including a reporter's guide to using education polling and surveying in your reporting. Highly recommend you take a look at that. It has some great suggestions on tips on how to make the most of survey data. We have a question for both of you, and we're going to start with Bib. This comes from Wayne Dorio, also one of our education journalists in the audience. Are there any misconceptions that are disproved by this survey data, or at least there's a leaning in that direction?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are several. One, there's sort of this narrative out there that parents are not engaged in their kids' learning and they're throwing their hands up and they can't handle it. And what we see, 2.5 hours a day on average for parents, that's a lot of time that they are dedicating despite all of the challenges and demands. So I think that's sort of a myth that gets busted here. Similarly, on average, 4.5 hours for kids is a lot of time based on a lot of the stories that are going out there. The kids aren't doing any kind of schoolwork. And we are seeing sort of a terrible dearth of support from districts to families. So I think that also needs to be really called out, and Holly's data shows this too, that the resources that parents are getting is not sufficient or adequate for instruction for their kids, but with whatever they're getting, they are really digging in. So I think that is an important narrative that needs to be shared out there that I haven't seen really reported yet.
Well, that's a good point. And Bib, can you just elaborate a little on what you found in terms of some of those support services, questions about mental health opportunities for families? Anything you know about the quality or what's being provided?
We weren't able to get into sort of those kinds of qualitative questions. So we just asked parents, did you have access to mental health support services from your district? And you can see it's a very low number, like 6%, I think. But of those who did have access, it was one of the more helpful resources that parents cited. So again, I think those personal resources really go a long way. Understanding what the expectations are for your child's learning, access to a hotline, the mental health support, one-to-one tutoring. Parents are just really hungry for help me and my kid, which I know is really difficult because teachers are just grappling with so much. But anything we can do to support that one-to-one interaction, I think is really critical and what parents are looking for.
Thank you so much, Bib. I know you may have to drop off momentarily, so if you do, we thank you in advance for taking the time to joining us today. Holly, I'd like to talk to you a little bit. What about you? Were there any surprises for you in the survey results or anything that ran counter to maybe what the conventional wisdom has been that's been evolving around how this is really panning out for schools and communities?
I was honestly quite surprised that teachers said that they were working less, because the narrative in the media has been we hear teachers saying they're working a lot more. But when I started looking at the data, it did make sense to me, because it's not, my sense is it's not that they don't necessarily, it's not that they necessarily want to work less, but they just, whether it's because they don't have the right technology, their students don't have the right technology, their students are not reachable, they don't have the support they need, it started making a lot more sense to me. So that was a little surprising to me. The other thing was, you hear a lot about districts running out and buying all these devices, but I don't know that, at least according to teachers, I don't know that they've necessarily gotten into the hands of everybody who needs them yet. Especially if we're saying that, now as before the coronavirus hit, only about half of schools have one-to-one computing. So that I thought that was, I kind of expected the more teachers to say, oh yeah, now we have one-to-one computing, than said it prior to the closures. So those were kind of two surprising things to me.
Are there plans to survey teachers about the technology they're using to connect with students? For example, what percentage are using online learning platforms versus, something just more straightforward like the school's email network?
Yeah, so we did have a question at one point where we asked them all these different, it might have been in this, the different approaches they were using. And again, we asked this question quite a while ago now. Let me see, but and we asked, so we're going to have updated data on this. What we found is that at least, back in March when we asked this question, the most common thing that teachers were doing was, as I said, not that sort of Zoom meeting with interaction between the teacher and students, but collecting work and returning it online. And then the second most common approach was sending home packets with students, followed by teachers recording themselves teaching lessons that they post so students can access them on demand. And then right after that was students and parents picking up packets in person. So again, I think this is going to shift a little when we look at the results from the current survey. But if you think that, that the bulk of learning is spent in this sort of interactive forum, I'm not sure that that's really what's going on right now.
What are a couple story ideas for local reporters who want to use the Ed Week data as a jumping point for their own coverage?
As I mentioned, it would be really interesting to track how students are spending time versus how teachers are spending time. I think it's going to be really important to look at how districts are starting to plan for. We know that there are going to be a lot of. We know that there are going to be both district leaders tell us that they expect to have spending decreases, and then we know from what's going on with local and state tax revenue that there are expected to be declines. So this is a time that has created a lot of additional needs for districts in terms of purchasing devices and offering teachers support and with this new type of learning. So if the demands are going up and the funding is going to expected to go down, what's going to give? I would look into what is the status of districts' plans in planning for next year. We have a question on the current survey. Are you going to be how crowded is your school? Are you going to be trying to do social distancing? If you try to do social distancing, how crowded will your school be versus how crowded was your school prior? So physically, how are districts going to be dealing with this if they do decide to have students come back in person, but then have students sit far apart from each other, for instance, or have classes? What if classes get smaller because you make sure that students are sitting fairly far apart from each other? That will require more teachers. How are districts going to be able to afford that? So, I think there's a lot out there that you can look into. The other thing that I don't feel like I have a great handle on is how districts are serving students with disabilities and English language learners. We do have a question about that on our current survey, but I think that's been something somewhat of a black box to me, and I'd love to see a little bit more on that. And then finally, I guess I'd like to know, as districts and schools do plan for the approach that they're going to be taking, to what extent are they involving families and having families be part of making the plans, instead of just saying having the plans done to them. So to what extent are they engaging families and not just having a listening session or two, and having and then having them involved in implementing the plans and developing the plans versus just saying, here's what we're going to do, we'll do a listening session and then we're just going to do this. There's a lot of change going on. So
I think it's really interesting, and also it's redefining what we think about as meaningful engagement. So, if you look at the Learning Heroes survey, and parents said most of them have had some kind of contact with their child's teacher, but very few of them had had a phone call, which is something that they want. We're all locked down, we're all separated from each other, and that voice-to-voice connection, I think it's actually a little more powerful now. So if I was a local reporter, I would be finding out, are you having conversations in your district about what meaningful engagement is with families and students right now? And it's not just an email or necessarily a learning platform, but also, how realistic an expectation is that? We know that class sizes are as big as they've been in a lot of places. And I think that would be a really interesting question is how are we redefining what we mean by valuable and meaningful engagement?
Mm-hmm.
Well, folks, we're coming to the top of the hour. We'll give folks just another second or two to ask any questions. Just a reminder, we will share our attendees' slides after the event. Holly's data comes from multiple Education Week surveys, so we'll pull a few of those and share those links with you as well. And again, she's got more data forthcoming. We're just going to give folks just another second or two to ask any questions. We really do appreciate you being here, Holly. We also are very grateful to Bib for making her time. I'd like to just quickly remind everybody that as soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please take a moment and complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us to improve. If you want to find out what's coming up next on the webinar agenda and also future EWA events, you can go to ewa.org/events, and you can sign up for our upcoming online training and opportunities. And again, don't forget, we have plenty of content to help you with this reporting. Go online to ewa.org and check out our topics pages. This has been a great discussion, and we really appreciate our attendees for being here. Holly Kurtz of Education Week Research Center and Deb Hubbard of Learning Heroes. And finally, I would like to thank today's attendees and EWA members for taking the time to join us. It's been terrific. Have a great day, everybody. We're going to close this out. If you have any questions, you can always reach me on erichmond@ewa.org. I'm your EWA public editor. It's been my pleasure to serve as moderator for today's event. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Have a great day, and thanks for joining us.